They called him reliable, a scribe who never questioned what he filed. But when they gave him access to the Inquisition's deepest vaults, Silas found something he was never meant to see. Records of entire worlds erased. Loyal citizens executed, orders signed by the highest authorities in the Imperium. And the worst part, none of it was a mistake. What do you do when the institution you serve is built on the bodies of the innocent? I was a good servant once. My name is Silas Dren, and for 23 years I have served the Ordo Hereticus as an archivist of the 4th rank, a keeper of forbidden histories, a compiler of truths too dangerous for the common faithful to comprehend. I tell you this not as confession but as testimony spoken into the void between what we believe and what we are. Recorded here in the final hours before my name joins the ranks of the disappeared, those countless souls whose service ended not in glory but in silence. The Imperium is vast beyond mortal comprehension, a machine of such staggering complexity that no single mind can grasp its workings. And I was content for decades to be a small cog in that machine, to catalog horrors committed in the Emperor's name and find solace in the certainty that every act of violence served a greater purpose. I processed reports of exterminatus declarations with steady hands. I cross-referenced lists of executed planetary governors with calm efficiency. I maintained databases of purged populations without question because I believed truly and completely that the architects of these decisions possessed wisdom I could never fathom. That their burden was heavier than mine. That the calculus of survival in a galaxy drowning in darkness required sacrifices I was blessed not to comprehend fully. The work was tedious, demanding absolute precision and unwavering discretion, and I performed it with the dedication of one who knows his place in the cosmic order. My quarters in the fortress monastery on Oily Iith were small but sufficient, a cell of greystone with a cot, a prayer stand, and a single picked slate for devotional readings. I rose each morning at the 4th bell, attended the dawn liturgies with my fellow archivists, consumed a ration of synthesized protein and recycled water, and descended into the vaults where the Inquisition keeps its deepest secrets. The vaults themselves were a labyrinth carved into bedrock, corridor after corridor of data stacks protected by void shields, gene-rocked doors, and servitor sentries whose eyes glowed red in the perpetual twilight. Temperature was maintained at exactly 12 degrees Celsius to preserve the ancient cogitators and parchment scrolls, and the air tasted of machine oil and sanctified incense. My supervisor, Interrogator Valence, was a severe woman with augment eyes that clicked in word when she focused on you, a veteran of 40 years in the archives who spoke rarely and never smiled. She approved my work without comment, which I understood to mean I was performing adequately. In all those years, I never questioned my purpose. I never doubted that the horrors I catalogued were necessary. I never imagined that faith itself could become a weapon turned inward, a blindfold woven from devotion that prevented us from seeing the truth of what we served. The assignment that changed everything arrived on a morning indistinguishable from any other. Interrogator Valence summoned me to her office, a cramped space lined with ancient texts bound in leather that might once have been human, and informed me that I had been selected for a priority compilation project. The Inquisitor, Lord Xerxes Morn, required a comprehensive historical analysis of operation cleansing protocols implemented across the segmentum obscurus over the past millennium, with particular focus on doctrinal justifications and strategic outcomes. It was an honor, she explained, her augmentatic eyes clicking as they adjusted focus on my face, searching perhaps for any sign of hesitation or pride. Few archivists ever received direct commissions from Inquisitor lords. The work would require access to sealed vaults normally restricted to interrogators and above, clearance granted under Morn's personal authority and monitored by automated surveillance that would record my every keystroke and eye movement. I was to compile, synthesize, and present my findings in a bound codex within 6 standard months, working alone to ensure absolute security. Valence handed me a data wafer containing access codes and left without another word, the door sliding shut behind her with a pneumatic hiss that seemed unusually final. I returned to my cell that night and prayed for 3 hours, thanking the Emperor for this opportunity to serve at a higher level, asking for the clarity and wisdom to fulfill my duty with precision and honor. Sleep came slowly. The fortress monastery's walls were thick, but I could still hear the distant chanting of the adepts conducting midnight vigils in the chapel 5 levels above, their voices rising and falling like waves against stone, beautiful and mournful in equal measure. I wondered if Inquisitor Lord Morn would find my work satisfactory. I wondered what insights he sought from the data, what patterns he hoped I would uncover. I did not yet understand that some patterns once perceived cannot be unseen, that certain truths corrode the foundations upon which faith is built, that the Imperium's survival depends as much on what its servants do not know as on what they do. The sealed vaults occupied the lowest level of the archive complex, accessible only through a mag-lev platform that descended for nearly 4 minutes into the planetary crust. I made my first journey there at dawn on the third day after receiving my assignment, clutching the data wafer in one sweating palm while reciting the litany of focus under my breath. The platform's walls were bare adamantium marked with purity seals and warning icons depicting skulls superimposed over closed eyes. A reminder that knowledge itself could be contamination. When the doors opened, I found myself in a chamber vastly larger than anything I had imagined. A cathedral of information stretching away into shadow, its ceiling lost somewhere overhead. Data stacks rose like monoliths, each 30 meters tall and humming with the power of sleeping coitators. Between them walked servitors on predetermined routes, their cybernetic components clicking and warring, their remaining organic parts withered and pallid. The air here was colder than in the standard archives, cold enough that my breath misted with each exhalation. I approached the central authentication shrine, a pulpit of brass and iron surmounted by a bronze aquila, and inserted the data wafer into the receptacle. Machinery engaged with a sound like grinding teeth. Light poured from the aquila's eyes, scanning my retinas and genetic markers, while a synthesized voice intoned clearance protocols in High Gothic. Access granted. I was directed to Station 7 in subsection Theta 9, a desk of dark wood that looked almost quaint amidst the technological enormity surrounding it. Equipped with a coitator terminal and a hooded reading lamp that cast a small circle of amber light. I sat and activated the terminal. The initial document manifest populated slowly, line after line of file designations appearing on the green-lit screen, each tagged with threat classifications and access restrictions that had been temporarily suspended under Moore's authority. I selected the first file at random, expecting to find the usual template of an Operation Cleansing, the standard format I had reviewed hundreds of times before. Heretical outbreak detected, investigation conducted, guilty parties identified, sentence carried out, population cleansed, emperor praised. The first document was indeed formatted according to standard protocols, but something in the content made me pause and read more carefully. The world in question was Temperance Prime, an agri-world in the Gothic sector, population 17 million, designated for cleansing following reports of heretical activity among the planetary leadership. The investigation summary occupied 3 pages of dense text describing widespread corruption, demonic possession of the governor and his council, evidence of chaos worship embedded in planetary administration. All of this was unremarkable. But then came the annexes, supplementary reports filed by investigating agents before the final authorization was given. The first annex was written by an interrogator named Catherine Voss, and her account described a world functioning with unusual efficiency, agricultural yields exceeding projections by 14%, tithe deliveries consistently on schedule, a population demonstrating high levels of devotion and compliance. Her investigation of the governor and council revealed no evidence of possession or heresy. The accusation had originated from a rival noble house seeking to seize planetary control, she concluded, and recommended no action beyond increased surveillance. This report was dated 3 weeks before the cleansing order. The second annex was written by a senior inquisitor dispatched to review Voss's findings. He concurred with her assessment, but noted that the rival house in question had strong connections to the administratum and the ecclesiarchy, that denying their accusation would create political complications, and that Temperance Prime's strategic value was minimal. His recommendation was for limited action against the governor alone, a surgical removal to satisfy political pressures without mass casualties. This report was dated 2 weeks before the cleansing. The final annex was the authorization itself, signed by an inquisitor lord whose name had been redacted, ordering complete planetary cleansing via orbital bombardment and atmospheric incendiaries, 17 million souls. No stated justification for the escalation from the investigators' recommendations. No explanation for why a world deemed loyal required total extermination. Just a signature and a date in the mechanical activation of weapons that turned an entire planet into a crematorium. I sat very still, staring at the screen, trying to reconcile what I had just read with everything I believed about the Inquisition's methods. Surely, there was context I was missing. Additional evidence gathered between the investigators' report and the final order. Intelligence too sensitive to commit to the record. I searched the file thoroughly, examining every attached document and data fragment, finding nothing that explained the discrepancy. 17 million people incinerated because it was politically convenient, because their planet's strategic value was insufficient to outweigh the bureaucratic cost of defending them. The words on the screen seemed to shimmer and distort as I read them again. I closed the file and opened another, telling myself this was an anomaly, a single case of flawed judgment among thousands of righteous acts. The second file concerned a mining colony on Gradius 9, population 8,000, cleansed for suspected Genisar infiltration. The investigation notes were brief but conclusive. No evidence of Xenos contamination detected. No biological markers in planetary screening. No behavioral anomalies. The local Arbites precinct had reported increased worker unrest over labor conditions, and an administrum economic analyst suggested that eliminating the existing population and replacing them with more compliant labor stock would improve long-term productivity. The cleansing was authorized on economic grounds, justified in the official record as preventative action against potential future corruption. 8,000 people incinerated from orbit so that their replacements would be more obedient. I opened a third file, then a fourth, then a dozen more. Each one revealed variations on the same pattern. Decisions made not from necessity but convenience. Populations exterminated not because they had fallen to heresy, but because allowing them to live created complications for imperial administration, because their continued existence was inconvenient to powerful interests, because the Inquisition existed in a system where the cost of innocent life carried less weight than the cost of political friction. The hours passed without my noticing. The servitors continued their patrols, their footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. The temperature seemed to drop further, though the cogitator's climate display showed no change. I worked through document after document, compiling notes with mechanical precision, while some deeper part of my mind struggled to process what I was reading. Not every cleansing followed this pattern. Many of the files contained exactly the evidence of heresy and corruption that justified the Imperium's terrible judgment. Worlds genuinely lost to chaos or Xenos influence. Populations so thoroughly compromised that their destruction was the only mercy available. But those righteous acts were interspersed with others that had no such justification. Orders carried out not to save humanity, but to maintain the administrative convenience of an empire too vast to distinguish between necessary sacrifice and bureaucratic murder. By the time the servitors activated the chamber's evening illumination sequence, a dim red glow that bathed everything in shades of blood and shadow, I had reviewed 47 files. 23 of them contained evidence of cleansing actions authorized against innocent or ambiguously guilty populations. Decisions made not by ignorant or corrupted officials, but by senior members of the Inquisition who understood exactly what they were doing. I logged out of the terminal and returned to the maglev platform, ascending through the stone in silence, emerging into the main archive levels where other scribes and archivists moved between stacks with bowed heads and quiet footsteps. None of them looked at me. None of them spoke. I walked through corridors I had traversed thousands of times, and they felt different now, as though the walls had shifted slightly, as though the familiar had become subtly alien. In my cell, I knelt before the prayer stand and tried to recite the evening devotional, but the words caught in my throat. I could see the faces I had never seen. 17 million souls on Temperance Prime, 8,000 on Gradius 9. Numbers transformed by narrative into people who had prayed to the Emperor and died for the crime of being inconvenient. I stayed on my knees until the stone floor numbed them, until my back ACHD and my vision blurred. Searching for the certainty that had always sustained me, finding only questions I did not want to ask. The work continued. Each morning I descended into the sealed vaults, and each evening I returned to my cell with new horrors catalogued in my mind. The pattern revealed itself more clearly with every file I reviewed, an architecture of calculated cruelty embedded so deeply in imperial operations that it functioned as standard procedure rather than aberration. I learned of forge worlds whose entire populations were executed after completing assigned production quotas, the Mechanicus deeming it more efficient to cycle through disposable labor than risk technological secrets spreading. I learned of hive worlds where deliberate food shortages were engineered to reduce excess population when demographic projections exceeded optimal density. Starvation deployed as policy while the administratum recorded it as natural attrition. I learned of frontier colonies abandoned to Xenos raiders despite having months to organize evacuation written off because the cost of rescue exceeded their economic value to the Imperium. Every act was documented with bureaucratic precision, filed and sealed and forgotten by everyone except archivists like myself, servants trained to witness horror without judgment, to process atrocity as data. The deeper I went into the records, the more I found not isolated incidents, but systematic practice, a philosophy of governance that accepted mass death, not as tragic necessity, but as tool of control. The Imperium did not survive in spite of these acts, but because of them, its vastness maintained through selective culling. its loyalty enforced through the certainty that dissent or inconvenience carried existential consequences. I discovered files detailing the purge of entire sectors whose only crime was requesting increased autonomy, independence crushed with such overwhelming violence that neighboring systems remained compliant for generations afterward. I found records of assassinated planetary governors who had attempted to implement reforms that would have improved civilian life at minimal cost to imperial tithes, eliminated because reform itself was deemed dangerous precedent. I read reports on psyker harvest operations that exceeded quota requirements by abducting non-cissors from compliant families. Children stolen and processed into the Imperium's great psychic machinery, their absence explained as divine calling while their parents wept behind closed doors. Each revelation built upon the previous one, constructing an understanding I did not want, could not reject. The moment of fracture came in my third month of research, when I accessed a file dated to the earliest years of the Imperium's founding, a period I had always imagined as more noble, more justified in its violence by the surrounding chaos. The document detailed a planetary compliance action on a world called Monarch's Rest, one of the first worlds encountered during the Great Crusade, notable because it had achieved compliance peacefully. Its human population welcoming the Emperor's forces with celebration and genuine joy. The file contained vid capture records of the initial contact, images of crowds gathering in city squares, children waving improvised banners, planetary leaders offering fealty without hesitation. Monarch's Rest was technologically advanced, possessing functioning aestheses, and a stable government that had maintained order through the age of strife. Its integration into the Imperium should have been celebrated as a triumph of unity over isolation. Instead, 3 months after compliance was achieved, the planet was systematically dismantled. Its population was distributed across a dozen newly conquered worlds as indentured labor. Its STC technologies were confiscated by the Mechanicus and never implemented. Its planetary leaders were executed for the crime of having governed successfully without the Emperor's direct guidance. Their competence deemed evidence of dangerous independence. The authorization came from the Primarch overseeing the sector, a figure whose name I will not speak even now, justified in the official record as necessary to establish proper imperial hierarchy and eliminate potential rivals to centralized authority. The population of Monarch's Rest numbered 43 million. They died, slowly, worked to death on worlds they had never seen. Their culture eradicated, their history erased, their crime nothing more than having survived without submitting to an authority they had willingly embraced when given the chance. I read this file 3 times, searching for the justification I had always believed must exist for even the most terrible imperial actions. I found only pragmatism divorced from morality, power exercised simply because it could be violence as demonstration rather than necessity. That night, I did not pray. I sat on my cot in the darkness, listening to the fortress monastery's ambient sounds, the distant hum of generators, the occasional clang of maintenance servitors moving through corridors, the whisper of recycled air through ventilation grills. My hands were shaking. I had spent 23 years serving an institution I believed was humanity's salvation, cataloging its sins with the faith that every sin served a greater purpose, that the architects of atrocity possessed wisdom I could not comprehend. But wisdom was not what I had found in the sealed vaults. I had found calculation, efficiency, the mathematics of control applied without moral constraint. The Inquisition did not make difficult choices between lesser evils. It made convenient choices, eliminating complications regardless of guilt or innocence, maintaining the Imperium not through justice, but through the systematic application of terror to anyone who might threaten its supremacy. Every planetary governor who woke wondering if today would bring an Inquisitor's investigation. Every citizen who understood that devotion was no guarantee of survival. Every world that paid its tithes and prayed its prayers while knowing that loyalty might not save them if their existence became inconvenient. The whole vast structure of the Imperium rested not on the Emperor's light, but on the certainty of arbitrary destruction, fear weaponized, and deployed with such consistency that it became indistinguishable from law. I had always known the Imperium was brutal, but I had believed its brutality was reactive, defensive, a terrible shield raised against the darkness pressing from all sides. What I had learned in the vaults was different. The brutality was foundational. The darkness we fought existed. Yes, chaos and Xenos and the 1,000 threats that haunted the galaxy. But we had become something just as monstrous in our response to them. A machine that consumed innocence as readily as guilt, that measured success not in lives saved, but in systems maintained, that had forgotten any purpose beyond its own perpetuation. I returned to the vaults the next morning because I did not know what else to do. The work continued. The months passed. I compiled my findings according to the assignment specifications, organizing the material chronologically and thematically, noting patterns in decision-making and authorization chains, documenting the evolution of cleansing protocols from emergency measure to standard practice. The codex grew thicker. My faith grew thinner, eroded not by sudden revelation, but by accumulation, death by death, world by world. Each individual atrocity small enough to rationalize until the whole mass of them became too heavy to bear. I discovered that many of the protocols I was documenting had been authored by inquisitors who were now legends within the Ordo. Figures whose wisdom was quoted in training sessions, whose methods were taught as exemplars of proper investigation. Their names appeared again and again in the authorization chains, consistent votes for maximum violence in situations where lesser responses were viable. Patterns suggesting that their legendary status derived not from righteousness, but from ruthlessness, from their willingness to choose expedience over mercy without hesitation or doubt. I learned the names of interrogators who had raised objections to cleansing orders and subsequently disappeared from all records, their questions answered with silence, their careers terminated, or more likely their lives. I found evidence that the Inquisition maintained internal purge lists, rosters of its own members deemed too sympathetic or too questioning, monitored and eliminated when their doubts threatened to become public. The organization I served did not tolerate dissent even within its own ranks. Its survival depended on the absolute conviction of its agents, any crack in that certainty treated as corruption requiring excision. The 5th month brought me to the core of the assignment. The documents Inquisitor Lord Morn specifically wanted analyzed. A sequence of files detailing Operation Cleansing authorizations signed by Inquisitor Lords across the past 3 centuries. This was the highest level of documentation decisions made by the most senior figures in the Order, the men and women who shaped inquisitorial policy and doctrine. I expected to find evidence of careful deliberation at this level, grave consideration of each choice. The wisdom that comes from bearing ultimate responsibility. What I found was the opposite. At this level, the pretense of investigation and justification fell away entirely. Worlds were marked for cleansing based on statistical modeling and threat assessment algorithms. Populations evaluated not as collections of individual souls but as data points in resource allocation matrices. A planet might be spared or condemned based on variables like shipping route proximity, tithe production efficiency or strategic buffer positioning, factors utterly divorced from the presence or absence of actual heresy. The Inquisitor Lords who authorized these mass deaths did so with signatures scrolled across digital documents in batches. Dozens of worlds condemned in single sessions. Their fates decided in the time it took to verify mathematical projections and ensure proper documentation for administratum records. There was no malice in it. That was somehow worse. They were not monsters, these Inquisitor Lords. They were administrators, managers of an impossible task, trying to hold together an empire spanning 1,000,000 worlds with tools inadequate to the scale. Making choices no human mind was designed to make, optimizing for survival of the whole, without capacity to grieve the parts sacrificed. They had become what the Imperium required them to become, so numb to atrocity that it registered only as paperwork, so convinced of their necessity that they never questioned whether the Imperium they preserved deserved preservation. Among these files, I found references to a document that was not included in my access permissions, a theoretical treatise coded as the Necessity of Darkness, authored collectively by the Inquisitorial Conclave 200 years prior. Multiple files referenced it as foundational doctrine, the philosophical justification underlying modern cleansing protocols, mandatory reading for all inquisitors achieving Lord rank. It was sealed under clearance so high that even Morn's authority could not grant me access, but fragments were quoted in secondary sources enough to reconstruct its central arguments. The treatise posited that humanity's survival required not just violence against external threats, but violence against itself, that a species as numerous and diverse as ours could only be held together through the elimination of deviation. That mercy itself was a luxury purchased with the blood of those deemed unworthy of receiving it. The Emperor's vision of a unified humanity could only be achieved through the systematic culling of any who might threaten that unity. Not just heretics and traitors, but the merely inconvenient, the potentially disloyal, the philosophically incompatible. The Necessity of Darkness argued that creating and maintaining a culture of absolute obedience required regular demonstrations of consequence, that populations allowed to live without fear of arbitrary punishment would inevitably drift toward independence and fragmentation. Therefore, the cleansing of innocent populations served a purpose beyond immediate threat elimination. It reinforced the fundamental truth that survival in the Imperium was conditional, that no amount of loyalty guaranteed safety, that the Emperor's servants lived always under the shadow of judgment. This was not corruption of the Imperium's ideals. This was the ideals made explicit, the foundation upon which 10,000 years of governance had been constructed. The dark truth that we archivists catalogued without comprehension, that inquisitors enforced without question, that defined humanity's collective existence in ways we were never meant to understand. I finished compiling the Codex in the final week of my 6th month. A leather-bound volume 300 pages thick, filled with tables and timelines and analytical summaries of exactly what Inquisitor Lord Morn had requested. The work was impeccable, every citation verified, every conclusion supported by evidence, every pattern identified and documented with the precision expected of a fourth-rank archivist. I could find no flaw in it as a piece of research. It was the finest work I had ever produced, comprehensive and unflinching in its examination of Operation Cleansing protocols, and it demonstrated beyond question that the systematic execution of innocent imperial citizens was not anomaly, but policy, not failure, but feature woven into the fabric of how we governed ourselves with the full knowledge and approval of our highest authorities. I held the finished Codex in my hands, its weight somehow enormous, despite its modest size, and I understood that I was holding a death sentence. Not just for the populations documented within its pages, their deaths already accomplished, but for myself, for the mere act of comprehending what I had compiled. The Inquisition had not granted me this access, because Morn wanted analysis. He had all the analysis he needed, had access to the necessity of darkness and centuries of precedent. He had granted me access because I was being tested, observed through every moment of my research, monitored to see whether I would maintain faith in the face of comprehensive revelation, or whether I would break, whether I would remain useful or become another data point requiring elimination. I thought of interrogator Catherine Voss, whose honest investigation of Temperance Prime had been disregarded in favor of political convenience. I thought of the interrogators whose questions led to disappearances. I thought of all the archivists and servants who had handled this material before me, granted access, and then quietly erased. Their very knowledge of these truths deemed too dangerous to allow them continued existence. I was one of them now. I had failed the test by understanding too much, by allowing that understanding to pierce the shell of faith that was meant to insulate servants like me from the implications of our service. The question became not whether I would die, but what I would do with the time remaining. I could deliver the Codex in hope that my faithful service would outweigh my dangerous knowledge. That Morn would accept my work and assign me back to regular archival duties, that the surveillance watching me had not detected the change in my Devatio.